The title of my dissertation is Trickster Dialogics, a method for articulating cultural archetypes from cue to performance art. And it is that broad. It runs from cue to performance art. And Trickster figures into so many different mythological systems that Carl Jung considered it a part of the collective unconscious, a powerful symbol of the commonalities of human experience. And as the tales reveal, for the interest of time I won't be reciting a tale, I did consider it, but I'm not going to. As the tales reveal, Trickster's most common role is to upset dominant orders, reshaping hostile physical and social environments to make them more habitable for humanity. This imbues Trickster with a particular spirit, a unique kind of performative critical consciousness that warrants further exploration. And that's what I do in this dissertation, is engage in that exploration. And Trickster has much to offer communication theory and practice. It offers a useful metaphor for helping performance studies and other kinds of critical scholarship to bridge the gap between performance theory and practices of subversive communication. So despite their endurance and longevity as cultural archetypes and objects of mythological and literary analyses, Trickster figures remain ambiguous. So the purpose of this dissertation, and of course this presentation, is to clarify what we mean when we say the word trickster. It does so by building on Trickster's archetypal elements to create a programmatic method for analysis that can be used to determine how and when a trickster may be in our midst. Yet Trickster figures still need to be connected to their social and cultural context. So beyond the Trickster part of Trickster Dialogics, I will also be discussing a dialogical method that I have developed from the work of Mikhail Bakhtin and some other people, including Julia Christina. With that grounding, here are the research questions that ground this dissertation. The overall research question is, what does it mean to perform Trickster in the contemporary cultural environment? And I have the answer up there. The answer is to reveal the infinite potential of better futures. But we have a kind of a long road to get there, and that's what we'll be discussing in this presentation, is how we can make that connection. It's on page 187 of my dissertation is exactly when I say that. So in order to get through to that answer, we need a couple of more questions. So a more specific research question is this one. Where can Trickster be found in actual communicative practice? So that's my first supporting research question. And I'll suggest in the dissertation, in this presentation, that we can find Tricksters in mass media, and that we can find Tricksters in performance art. In mass media, I'll use the figure of Q from Star Trek The Next Generation to exemplify a Trickster figure. And then in performance art, I'll use the artists Andre Stitt, Anne Liv Young, and Stephen Johnson Leva. And just to, so these are ideal starting points for figuring out where we might find Tricksters, mostly because Tricksters are mythological figures, and media is an obvious place to look for that kind of thing. Also, of those three performance arts, two of them self-identify as Tricksters. And so it's a clear and logical place to look. This doesn't necessarily mean that all performance artists are Tricksters, but it does mean that performance art has an affinity with the Trickster roles, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. Leading to my next research question. How is Trickster manifested in performance art? And what I'll suggest is that it's manifested through the use of the body as an art object in accordance with the Trickster archetype, and especially, and this is really important, its critical spirit. The critical spirit is a crucial part of Trickster figures. Without it, things that just appear to use elements of the Trickster role are really just caricatures. They don't really perform the Trickster role. They appear to, but they don't actually go all the way through. And what I'll suggest in the end is that Andre Stitt does perform Trickster. I'll suggest that Anne Liv Young does not, and that Stephen Johnson Leva does. This isn't to level judgment at Anne Liv Young as far as the quality of her artwork. It's just to say that she doesn't fit into this role, despite that she uses many of the same kinds of tactics. So that's the second research question. And in order to make those determinations, we need a clear conception of who Trickster is and its role in social and cultural practices. But there are a couple of problems that we need to address first. So Wile E. Coyote is a coyote, and Coyote is one of the most common trickster figures. But Wile E. Coyote is not a trickster, and he doesn't really perform the trickster role. And that's one of the things that I want to try and emphasize throughout this dissertation, is that performing elements of the role doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually being or performing a trickster, because there's the lack of the critical spirit. And one of the things that ties trickster figures together is this critical populist spirit. So we have some problems. Despite numerous efforts at articulating trickster figures, it still remains unclear. So in other words, just because Wile E. Coyote is a coyote doesn't mean that he's a trickster. We're often confronted with caricatures of trickster because of this, and I think that that's an issue. I addressed that in the dissertation and in an article that I recently published about it. So another problem is a paradox of putting boundaries around a figure that necessarily defies boundaries. Trickster figures, by their very being, cross boundaries. And if we put boundaries around a trickster figure, if we try and define it, we create a difficult paradoxical situation that's kind of hard to get out of, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is why I take trickster as an archetype, as opposed to as a definitional role. An archetype is a flexible set of constructs, or an idealized figure that no one thing ever perfectly adheres to. They offer an alternative to positivistic classifications, and they don't force things into pathological boxes. So we can make determinations about trickster if we think of it as an archetype, as opposed to thinking of it as a specific and very clearly defined role. And then the last problem is what we do once we've actually caught trickster. Just like Wile E. Coyote asks, what do we do now? And this is why I thought we needed a dialogical method. It wasn't enough to just discuss trickster by itself. I wanted to see how trickster would connect with or articulate with its social cultural context, and to see to develop a method that would allow me to do that. Dialogics was an ideal situation. Dissertations also do things in the world, just like trickster figures. And this particular dissertation should clarify the meaning and use of trickster figures in cultural criticism, should help develop an interpretive framework for trickster performances, help develop a dialogical method for analysis, and help open space for other kinds of dialogics. And we'll talk about that towards the end. So what we need to do now is figure out just exactly who trickster is. And trickster is a pan-global mythological figure. They appear or are manifested in almost all indigenous mythologies worldwide. The most common figure that we'll be aware of in the United States is the Native American figure of coyote, but other Native American figures include hare and rabbit and whiskey jack and spider and iktomi and a number of others. But there's also in Mesoamerica, Tezcatlipoca and Avalon-Zacob. Those are both, interestingly enough, related to smoke and mirrors. Tezcatlipoca is the Aztec and Avalon-Zacob is the Mayan. Interestingly enough, if you see the background there, that is the transfer for the tattoo of Avalon-Zacob that I happen to have on my wrist, which I got a long time ago before I was ever interested in this kind of stuff. Nasruddin is a Middle Eastern trickster. Shiva is from India. The Monkey King is from China. Maui is from Polynesia. Loki is from the Nordic countries. Rainer the Fox is from France. Till Eulenspiegel is from Germany. Wagner famously wrote a big composition about Till Eulenspiegel. Esu Eligbara is the Yoruba trickster from Africa. Satan is oftentimes considered to be a trickster as well as Buddha in some respects. So an interesting connection in Esu Eligbara and Satan. If you've ever seen the movie Crossroads, where somebody learns how to play the blues, Ralph Macchio, the Karate Kid, learns how to play the blues. There's an interesting, he learns to play the blues from an old guy, and this old guy has sold his soul to the devil. And the devil is Legba, which you can see is contained right within the name, Esu Eligbara. And of course that makes a direct connection to Satan. So there's some interesting and really rich connections there that I intend to explore sometime in the future, but not right now. And there are lots more, I should add. So the primary act of a trickster is to cross borders. That's the first and foremost thing they do. If there's a trickster in a story, there's a border being crossed. As a result of its crossing borders, and there are a number of steps in between, but we'll get there. As a result of its crossing borders, it becomes both cultural hero and stumbling buffoon. And as a culture hero, what the trickster does is bring necessary cultural tools to the people. This includes things like language, and fire, and water, and even death. And one of the ways that trickster usually gets those things is by stealing them. I would use the term liberating, but some other people use the term stealing, so that's okay. That's theft implies a kind of corporeal presence, a bodily presence, that also suggests the second role of stumbling buffoon. And what's interesting in most of the existing literature is that these two roles are often presented as dialectical oppositions, that they're countering each other and trying to transcend. But my suggestion in the dissertation is that they're actually dialogically related, and that they speak to each other, and that they're totally inseparable. Where one role is, so is the other. And that's mostly because trickster becomes cultural hero through its actions as a stumbling buffoon. If it didn't stumble as a buffoon, it wouldn't become the cultural hero. So even though we can talk about them as different, and that's obviously helpful and heuristic, we still need to understand that those two roles really are the same thing. So we have an overarching purpose, a populist kind of spirit that I call quixotic utopianism, which I'll develop a little bit more here in a moment. This overarching purpose is creating better worlds, and this is what we see through the tales. If we read the tales, we see that almost inevitably, Trickster will come along and liberate water from people who have hoarded it, or liberate fire from a malfeasant god. And I call this quixotic utopianism, like I said, we'll get to that in a little bit more in a moment. It also has an underlying telos of manipulating relationships. So there is no trickster if there are not people to manipulate. And so the trick, in other words, exists in the fact that it manipulates other people's, it manipulates other people. So quixotic utopianism is what I suggest is a connection to critical theory. And utopia has often been a subject of critical theory, at the very least since critical theory with capital letters, at the very least since Ernest Bloch in the beginning of the 20th century. And what utopia suggests through this Frankfurt School kind of critical theory is a world free of normative domination. I think that that's probably the easiest and most elegant way to put it. But utopia is also manifold. There can be lots of different kinds of utopias, and a lot of utopian thought, as of recently, has taken on the character of futurity. And futurity is looking forward and thinking about the possible transformations or the possibilities of transforming existing social hierarchies. I use the term extant up there because it feels a little bit better, but I do understand that the word extant means something that exists now but is somewhat outdated, right? That's always been a pet peeve of mine, is the misuse of the word extant. So that's what I suggest quixotic utopianism is. And I claim that it's the critical spirit of Trickster, that Trickster's critical spirit is quixotic utopianism, and that this critical spirit also connects to performance studies. And it connects to performance studies in its attempting to create worlds through performative practices. Another connection, or other connections with performance studies, are this sort of reckless abandon. Don Quixote, as we know, tilted famously at windmills and tried to change the world for the better, regardless of what the possible consequences might be. And even if you didn't agree with the world that Don Quixote tried to change into, you wanted a world of chivalry and romance. Even if that wasn't your utopia, it was a utopia, and he pursued it no matter what. And that's what that's how I connect it to trickster figures, because they do a similar thing. They do what they're interested in doing. They don't really care about the consequences. It seems hedonistic and selfish, but it ultimately serves the interests of other people as well. So there's also some trafficking in delusional appearances, and I would say that all representations are delusions. So performance studies, I use the somewhat provocative term in the dissertation that performance studies is delusional. And I do that on purpose, but it's not to say that it's delusional in a negative way. It's to say that it traffics in appearances and representations are always distorted. They're always a little bit delusional. And another connection to performance studies is that tricksters are embodied and corporeal beings. I developed that at length in the dissertation. I won't develop it too much here. So we have ultimately a trickster spirit that tries to make the world to be more habitable. It manipulates human relationships. It's a figure of cultural subversion, and it denies hegemonic normativity. So taken together, those things I collect under the heading of trickster spirit. Which brings us to the actual trickster archetype. So the archetype that I develop is more than just an archetype itself. It's actually a process for analysis. And what I do is I create the steps in such a way that they progressively build on each other. So each archetypal element allows the next archetypal element to be. So the first one, as I mentioned before, is a fundamental act of crossing borders. That's a fundamental act. And as a result of crossing borders, we end up with the twin ontologies of liminality and ambiguity, and the tactics of duplicity, shape-shifting, and humor, and, as I mentioned already, the twin roles of culture hero and stumbling buffoon. I'll take each one of those in turn. The fundamental act of crossing borders suggests that borders are crossed in every trickster tales, and really the important thing is that it highlights the social construction of normativity. All borders, all normative practices are socially constructed, and as a result of them being socially constructed, they're also necessarily unstable. They can always be challenged. And as a result of this challenge, that's where we get the ontologies of ambiguity and liminality. So, as I suggest here, ambiguity is a resistance to categorical definitions and positivistic classificatory schema. And liminality is a process of constant change. What liminality suggests is that social being is never certain. Social things are never certain because they're always at least slightly ambiguous. And since things are at least slightly ambiguous, they're in a process of constant change. This is a circular process. That's why I take in the dissertation ambiguity and liminality together. And I use the icon that has a little arrow. I don't know if you've seen critical studies, cultural methodologies, whatever that journal's called, with a little arrow, put that arrow. So after connecting border crossing to the twin ontologies of ambiguity and liminality, that's the point at which we can actually start discussing particular tactics. And the tactics are the biggest variables in trickster figures. These are the parts of the archetype that will vary the most. And we have duplicity, which is a particular form of deception, like speaking with one voice and meaning with another, but with a critical purpose. And that's the distinction that I make between duplicity and deception in the dissertation. Deception itself lacks the critical intent, and duplicity connects to the critical spirit. Shape-shifting is a particular kind of duplicity that works at the level of appearances, and humor is a means of disarming the power of seriousness through irreverence. There are more complications with humor as well, but I think that this is the biggest and most important one. So after the tactics, and after we've discussed the ontologies, and after we've discussed the role of crossing borders, then we can talk about the cultural roles. And as like I said before, as a culture hero, Trickster brings cultural tools to the people, and as a stumbling buffoon, it provides those tools through comic folly and misadventures. So that brings us to our first Trickster case study. I use the character Q as to discuss Trickster alone. I don't discuss Q in terms of Trickster Dialogics. I save that for performance art. But I wanted to be able to articulate Trickster by itself. And I think that my committee members were right in guiding me to do so. So I use the character Q to suggest how the Trickster role can be performed within the world of Star Wars The Next Generation. And what Q does at the beginning of the series, Q appears in 8 episodes of the entire series. In the very first one, the pilot episode, he indicts humanity for the, he indicts the crew of the Enterprise for the crimes of humanity. They have managed to weasel their way out, but over the course of the entire series, Q appears to play around with them and to interfere with their lives. But he does so with a purpose that looks nothing like this. This is the very final scene of the series. Second to last.
The Continuum didn't think you had it in you, Jean-Luc. But I knew you did.
You're saying that it worked? We collapsed the anomaly.
Is that all this meant to you? Just another spatial anomaly, just another day at the office?
Did it work?
Well, you're here, aren't you? You're talking to me, aren't you?
What about my crew?
The anomaly, my ship, my crew. I suppose you're worried about your fish, too. Well, if it puts your mind at ease, you've saved humanity once again.
Thank you.
For what?
You had a hand in helping me get out of this.
I was the one that got you into it. A directive from the Continuum. The part about the helping hand, though, was my idea.
I sincerely hope that this is the last time that I find myself here.
You just don't get it, do you, Jean-Luc? The trial never ends. We wanted to see if you had the ability to expand your mind and your horizons. And for one brief moment, you did.
When I realized the paradox.
Exactly. For that one fraction of a second, you were open to options you had never considered. That is the exploration that awaits you. Not mapping stars and studying nebula, but charting the unknown possibilities of existence.
Q, what is it that you're trying to tell me?
You'll find out. In any case, I'll be watching. And if you're very lucky, I'll drop by to say hello from time to time. See you out there.
So what Q does is ultimately give an opportunity for humanity to develop far beyond its own existing capacities. I thought that was just lovely. When I started watching this series, when I started watching this series the latest time around, I was just getting through the comps stage of this process, and I realized that Q sort of performed a trickster. I explained this more in the dissertation, but I was totally struck by how much of a trickster figure that Q really became. And what I thought was really interesting was when I watched the making of The Next Generation, Jonathan Frakes, who plays Commander Riker, called Q a villain. And I thought that was really interesting because Q's not a villain, he's a trickster. And what he does is help humanity to develop beyond itself, but he does so in a way that plays dangerous games and where people actually die. But he does it because there's an ultimate critical purpose. There's ultimately makes humanity a better race than it had been, which is of course why he also puts humanity on trial for its crimes. So this makes Q the driving force of the series. And what I'll suggest is that Q exhibits all of the archetypal elements, he demonstrates the critical spirits, he manipulates lots of different relationships, and I explain those in detail as well. But one of the more important things about this is that he suggests without demanding specific outcomes. He gives humanities the tools to use, but he doesn't necessarily tell them how to use those tools. And that, I think, is a really important thing, because it allows for some flexibility of outcome, something like infinite potential, that we might find in better futures. So analyzing Trickster alone doesn't go far enough to connecting it as a cultural figure to communicative practices and to socio-cultural contexts, which is why I wanted to develop a dialogical method to go along with it. So we need another set of analytics. I've developed dialogics as a possible paradigm or meta theory for social research in general, and as a specific method in this dissertation. The basic assumption is that social processes are structured like a dialogue, similar to the way that Lacan would say that the subconscious is structured like a language. What this is an augmentation of dialectics. I don't suggest that this should be a replacement of dialectics, although Julia Kristeva does. I don't suggest that, but I do think that it's an augmentation of dialectics as a framework for cognition, for thinking through problems. Dialogics has been deployed, I think, relatively weakly by a couple of other people. There's relational dialectics from Braithwaite and Baxter. They talk about dialogics a little bit as they develop their relational dialectics. And an interesting one is Thomas Frentz and Janice Hawker-Rushing, who published an article a couple years ago that they called the dialogical method, but it was really just them speaking to each other. Right? And that was interesting, but I think the method that I develop or that I offer here is somewhat different from that. It offers a specific set of analytics that we can use. So I developed them from Bakhtin's ideas and other people's extensions and applications, most notably Svetlana Todorov, Julia Kristeva, and Michael Holquist. And the method that I developed, and that I'll discuss here momentarily, is expandable, and it has some built-in flexibility. And it is built on these three different ideas of the utterance, of intertextuality, and of the chronotope. So the utterance is a basic unit of speech, and it's often used as a metric in communication studies. It's a common concept. Bakhtin himself is relatively unclear on this. He talks about utterance in terms of grunts, all the way to terms of very complex narratives. So it can, I suggest that utterance can fall anywhere in between those. And what we need to do is to define which utterance we're using and why we're using that particular utterance. Just to preview, I'll suggest that the case studies that I use, each performance is the utterance. But you could, if you wanted to, break out little pieces of those performances and talk about them in terms of utterance as well. It would just be a deeper kind of analysis. So utterance is another way of describing the communicative act, and it allows for wide-ranging kinds of discussions as long as they're sufficiently justified. And ultimately what the utterance does is to bound the artifact in connection, and bound the artifact that you're analyzing. But we need another step to connect it to its social context, and that's what intertextuality is. So the second step is intertextuality, and this makes the connection between text and context. What it addresses are historical conditions, conditions of production. One of the artists that I use as a case study is in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, which is during the context of the Troubles. And that's clearly one of the things that he'll be referencing in his art. Another thing is internal referentiality. In other words, what other kinds of artifacts are being drawn in. This is the more typical definition of intertextuality. And then also its potential influence or rhetorical impact, I think, is also important to at least address if not discuss in detail. Chronotope, the next step, helps us connect intertextuality to a particular place and time. And it's more than just the time and space or the genre of the artifact, but it's also, as Holquist suggests, the relationship between any text and its times. So we have a lot of flexibility with the chronotope as to what we can do with it, but one of the things that I think is important is to keep the spirit of the word alive and to keep at least referencing, if not deeply engaging, the idea of space and time. So what we'll do is I'll discuss each of the case studies that I have in terms of these three concepts, and then I'll put together a trickster chronotope, which will conclude our presentation. So the chronotope specifically refers to space and time. You have two different dimensions that you can use for that. You have an internal space and time. You have the way that space and time are manipulated from within an artifact. For instance, Q manipulates space and time in lots of different ways. But it would also be interesting to address the external chronotope as well, the space and time that's around an artifact. And this can happen thinking about historical conditions and other external influencing factors. So what we get by going through this process of analyzing performance art with this method is that we can discuss the chronotope of each individual artist, and then we can also put together a trickster chronotope. And to put together Trickster Dialogics briefly, before we talk about my case studies, it uses the tenets of the Trickster role as heuristics for understanding the dialogical processes that shape social normativity. I should have put a comma in there somewhere. It's inherently critical, and it's inherently performative.
Doesn't need a comma.
No? Maybe a dash? How about a semicolon?
More words.
It's an academic thing. It needs a semicolon.
It needs more words.
It's got to have a semicolon. And like I said, it's inherently critical and it's inherently performative. So the sites of analysis that I use is performance art. I have a brief discussion in the dissertation about the connections between Trickster and performance art. And the performance artists that I decided to use are Andre Stitt, Anne Luke Young, and Stephen Johnson Labo. I use those particular artists because they all have very, very similar tactics. They all do very similar things, but the meaning of them is much different. So Andre Stitt is the first one. He self-identifies as a trickster. And his performance, I addressed two of his performances in the dissertation. One of them is called Art is Not a Mirror. I'm going to swear here. It's called Art is Not a Mirror. It's a fucking hammer. And the other performance is called Dogs in Heat. So for the first performance, like I said, Andre Stitt was a Northern Irish artist in the 1970s, so he's in the context of the Troubles. And what he does in Belfast is he spray paints graffiti on the walls. And one of the most striking words that he paints on the walls is the word boring, which he then signs and dates. And this is a really interesting word to spray paint in the context of a civil conflict, right? You're making a lot of you're leveling a lot of accusations as to what it is that you find boring. It's certainly not, the boredom of a, rural country life that he's talking about. So this particular performance culminates in his burning his paintings in front of his art school that he had just recently graduated from, and smearing himself with blood. And this is a response to the institutionalization of art. And I suggest that it's also about democratizing access, right? It's about giving art back to the people and taking it out of the gallery. One of the things that's interesting about that, though, is by doing the graffiti, he turns the street into a gallery space, right? So there's this interesting complication about what it means to be institutionalized that I address much more in the dissertation as well. In Dogs in Heat, if you can't see the text up there, it's at the bottom. It says, "They stop and search us. They give us lip, but we can't answer back. They treat us like animals. As long as they're wearing a uniform, they think they can do anything." And during this performance, he took on the persona of a dog, walked around on all fours, and rolled around on a canvas that was covered in pigment and dog feces. While he was doing that, projected behind him were images of, not really of graphic violence, but images of very specific Northern Irish kind of conflict sort of violence. So him wrestling with his performance partner is some of the images that he projects. Also, and this is what I find really interesting, is the Belfast peace line, which is a wall that they built between the Protestant and the Catholic communities. And to call that a peace line, I think, is just absolutely fascinating in and of itself. But to project that behind him rolling around in dog shit on the floor, I think is also a little bit more complicated. So this, I suggest, is a response to the violence of the Troubles. Clearly it's a response to the violence of the Troubles. And more importantly, it's a response to the conditioning of his identity. And that's what I'll discuss at length in the dissertation. So it's about how he is conditioned to be a dog through his contextual, through the context of the Troubles, and through institutionalized violence. So my conclusion for Andre Stitt is that he performs Trickster, but he does so in a way that kind of lacks the humor and duplicity. There's not a lot of duplicity to be found. We could say that performance art in and of itself requires duplicity because it's performance art. But that, to me, doesn't do me a whole lot of good. So I really suggest that it kind of lacks the humor and it lacks duplicity. He says that he thinks it's funny. I don't know. I didn't necessarily find humor in it. I didn't find the kind of outright knee-slapping, ha-ha, that's funny, Louis C.K. sort of humor. But I can see where he would think that it's funny. But my suggestion is that ultimately it lacks the Trickster kind of humor. But that doesn't change the fact that he still performs Trickster. He exhibits the critical spirit, he exhibits chaotic utopianism, and he manipulates relationships. Most importantly, the relationships between self and society, and even between self and self, the internal relationship, an intrapersonal relationship. So that's at the Trickster level. At the dialogical level, I suggest that the utterance is the action. He calls his performances actions. He self-calls them actions. He said, from the time he develops the word shortly after the first set of performances, from that point forward, he calls all of his performances actions, which he likes to spell thusly. I don't know. As far as intertextuality goes, I suggest that he connects the context of gallery spaces and the troubles. And if we think about those two things, we see a theme of institutionalization. And as far as institutionalization goes, that's really what he's trying to address with that sort of intertextuality. He's drawing in the gallery space, and he's drawing in the street, and he's drawing in the troubles, and then putting them back out. At the level of the chronotope, it's an artistic manipulation of space and time. He's in a very particular space and time, and he uses that space and time to critique that space and time. Which brings us to Anne Liv Young. Anne Liv Young performed at the New York Museum of Modern Art on February 27, 2010 at the PS1 space, and it was a curated event called Brooklyn is Burning. I'm not going to show very much of this, I'm just going to show a little bit. She posted this on Facebook, which is interesting because there's full nudity. We're not going to look at the full nudity part, but there's full nudity in here. And I'm just going to give you a brief. Yes, she's doing what she was. Sorry, I just. Don't come back on. She gets cut off at that point, so let me explain how she gets there. There we go. So, at that performance, Anne Liv Young had been prevented from selling DVDs, and so by the gallery. So what she did in response was to urinate in a pan, which before the part that we started watching. And then tried to sell that pan for $1,000. Right there, shortly after the power gets cut off, she spills it. So I don't know how much it would be worth after that. But so she starts the performance, and that's the intention of the performance, is to protest I would say, to protest the restriction of voice, right? The protest of her ability to profit from the performance. But what she does at the very beginning of the performance is come out and insult the performer before her. And so the people that she was exchanging with, in such a vulgar manner, the people that she was exchanging with was the previous performer and her girlfriend, who Anne LeBlanc had insulted by saying that her art was terrible, and she didn't understand why it was that anybody would like such a thing. The previous performer, just to say, her name was Georgia Sondry, and she had come out and walked around asking where Georgia was. She said her name was Jane and kept asking where Georgia was. So that's what Anne LeBlanc was responding to. And my suggestion is that in this process, Anne LeBlanc not only loses control over the performance, you can see she loses control pretty dramatically, but she only is able to gain control at that moment where the power is cut off. And when she's able to gain control, then she doesn't have as much of a stance for continuing with her actual performance. Interestingly enough, it nearly comes to blows at a previous point. But what the meaning of this is, at least to me, is that Anne LeBlanc positions herself as the arbiter, right? So rather than like Andre Stitt and democratizing access to art, she positions herself as the person who controls access to art. And I believe that is a not very Trickster-like thing to do, which is why I don't think that she performs Trickster. So she uses Trickster-like tactics. She includes the body. She uses, in fact, even more so than all the other two artists that I addressed, she uses all of the Trickster tactics, but she concentrates on aggrandizing herself, and she concentrates on maintaining her own ability to profit from her artwork, as opposed to extending that to other people with a wider critical spirit. So again, I'm not suggesting this to make judgments about the quality of her art or what she did. I actually think what she did was really interesting. But as far as whether or not it falls into a Trickster schema, I don't believe that it does. It's also interesting, though, dialogically. So even though if you can't call her a Trickster, it's still good to go through that process, and it's still good to go through the dialogical process as well. Again, we find that the performance itself is the utterance, and intertextuality, much like Andre Stitt, connects the performance to the gallery space. But in her chronotope, I think reflects questions of voice and access. So under what conditions do you have voice, and under what conditions do you have access to power? And this brings us to Stephen Johnson Leyba. Stephen Johnson Leyba was invited to perform at the Jack Davis birthday party in 1997 in San Francisco. Jack Davis was a high-powered San Francisco politico. He was a political consultant. He had consulted for Mayor Willie Brown. And as a result of those connections, Mayor Willie Brown was in attendance at this performance, as were the sheriff of San Francisco and a number of the members of the San Francisco 49ers. Because at the time, they were trying to pass a bill to build a brand new stadium. But this stadium was going to be built, supposedly, at least according to Leyba, on an old Indian burial ground, or Indian land. Of course, we can look at a lot of land as being that way. And ultimately, though, people were going to lose their homes, right? The stadium was going to be an issue, it was going to cause some real problems in the city, all for the benefit of the San Francisco 49ers. So during this performance, and before what I'm about to show you, he has an Apache star cut into his back with a scalpel. A woman urinates on the open wounds and then collects the blood and stuff, and he drinks it, and then he gets here.
Of the government, and whenever any form of government becomes disruptive of these ends, it is the
The last thing that, if you didn't catch what he said, was the unspeakable destruction of these United States, which is going to connect directly to a critical spirit. Also, I should mention the concluding part of this performance. Well, at this point, he's cut off. He, just like Anne Liv Young, the power's cut on him. And he goes to Jack Davis and convinces him to allow him to continue. After all of this has gone down, convinces him to allow this to continue. And is then, you see that in that image right there, that's a woman dressed as Pocahontas. She's about to put a bottle of Jack Daniels into a custom-made strap-on harness. And she's about to sodomize him with that bottle of whiskey, which occurs on stage in front of all of those people. Of course, most of them claim to have left before that actually happened. One of the things about that, though, is in his statement before this happens, he says that alcohol, and I use his words, has fucked up 7 generations of his family, and if it's going to fuck him, it's going to fuck him in the ass. Which I suggest in the dissertation is something along the lines of a pleasurable act, right? You can see that as being read in a couple of different ways. I didn't bring them out, I'm sorry. I totally forgot. Here are Andre Stitz and Stephen Johnson Leva's books. All the performances that I've discussed are in there. Yeah. I suggest that as a result of this performance, Stephen Leva performs Trickster, and I really suggest that he lacks humor, duplicity, and safe shapeshifting in their obvious senses. Again, we could say that there's some duplicity in that he's, in that he's doing performance art. We could say that there's some humor in the whole entire situation, but the performance in and of itself I don't necessarily think is very funny. And as far as shapeshifting goes, perhaps we could see some of the alteration of the body, some of the modification of the body as being shapeshifting, but I think that that's a little shallow. Still, this doesn't change the fact that he exhibits a very strong critical spirit, that he manipulates relationships, and that he exemplifies the roles of culture hero and stumbling buffoon. And what's interesting about Leva's performance is, unlike Stitt, who's trying to return power to the people, Leva's trying to take power away from the politicians, which I think is a unique distinction and something that's important to discuss. So I do discuss that in the dissertation. As far as dialogics go, again, the performance is the utterance. We have an intertextuality of the immediate context. He's drawing in stuff that's happening around him. So there's this bill about the stadium. He's in the context of a political party in its literal sense. And he's addressing U.S. imperialism in a lot of different ways. As far as his chronotope goes, he critiques systems of injustice. He internalizes guilt and levels it at others in a Burkean kind of way. So taking all of these together, we can start developing a Trickster chronotope. And the Trickster chronotope has, at least here, 6 different related pieces. These are all things that are common to Trickster. These are things that Trickster brings into the world, things that Trickster manifests, ways that it operates in relationship to other people. The first of those is freedom, total and utter freedom. A complete disregard for all normative systems and all rules, which allows it to be a quintessential other. Trickster is often discussed in the literature as a quintessential other. This is a paradoxical configuration, and what it allows us to start thinking about is synchronicity. Synchronicity, Carl Jung suggests, is the way that we as human beings ascribe meaning to chance occurrences. So something happens by chance, and we ascribe meaning to it, and that's what we think of as synchronicitous kinds of events. Chance is obviously part of that, and as a result of chance, we have the ability to improvise. And through improvisation, we gain the capacity for finding the infinite potential of better futures. That's how we get from my research question 1 to my answer of infinite potential of better futures. As far as contributions go, at the Trickster level, we have a practical role for social subversion and a model for archetypal analyses. And as far as dialogics goes, we have a new method and a possible paradigm for social research regarding expansion, Each concept that I have here warrants further expansion. I felt like I could develop each of them in a deeper way. We also have the possibility of different kinds of dialogics. I was thinking about a punk rock dialogics. You know, what does it mean to have like a very particular sort of punk rock way of being in the world, right? And so that was interesting to me too. And we also have the possibility of deployment as a generative tool, meaning a conscious use of the Trickster archetype to create communication artifacts, whatever they may be. And that's it. So thank you for your time.